Okay, so let's get started. Just want to introduce our panel, and this is a really exciting team of leaders in this space. And I'm going to ask them to just introduce themselves, talk a little bit about where they work, and describe what rules of code means to them in sort of 5 words or less. So starting out, why don't we pass it on to Jason?
Oh, thank you very much. My name is Jason Morris. I am a lawyer in Sherwood Park, Alberta, Canada. And I actually spend most of my time right now working as a senior researcher in symbolic artificial intelligence at the Singapore Management University Center for Computational Law, which is a bit of a mouthful. But basically, my day job involves researching and trying to build and experiment with new technologies to make it easier to encode legislation and contracts. So we're trying to build the infrastructure for rules as code. Rules as code, from my perspective, is an opportunity to have the laws be the source code for their own implementations. And yeah, I think that's me.
Great. Wonderful. Okay, over to you, Marco.
Hi, thank you. So I'm Marco Quiroga. I'm a policy and engagement officer working at BETA-Gouv in France. So BETA-Gouv is France Prime Minister's entrepreneurship program. The pitch is the mission of BETA-Gouv is to transform government by encouraging civil servants to take action from within government. So the idea is instead of just buying GovTech, we can build new digital services. So civil service can build digital services by themselves, and my job is to actually help them do so. Why I am here today is because I have been contributing to a piece of software called OpenFisca for years now, and OpenFisca is one of the softwares available in the space that allow to write our legislation into code, and that helps to build digital services that need to interpret legislation, and that's me.
Great, thanks so much. And over to you, Pia.
Merci. Thank you for having me today. My 5 words I'm going to try are agile, predictable, machine consumable law. Well, maybe legislation, but it's very, very tricky to try to get those 5 words boiled down. So let me just very quickly introduce, I guess, the concept. I have been working at the intersection of technology, government, and society for about 20 years in private and public sectors. And the realization about 5 years ago is that legislation is the operating model on which society is built, at least in our Westminster-based countries and a number of others. Legislation and regulation provides, if you like, the authoritative starting point. And then we build on top of that so many other things. We build policies, we build services, we build compliance, we build many things on top of that. And the realization that when I was working at the intelligence agency, financial intelligence agency, that the way that everyone interprets it is differently. And I have a child here, so I'll leave it there and I'll come back to you.
We'll get back to you in a sec, Pia. Marco, I know you had your 5 words you wanted to say, so go for it.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, I just forgot my 5 words. So what rules as code means to me is understanding, transparency, collaboration, improvement, and accountability. So quickly, we create rules that really few people understand. The way that we implement them is not really transparent. It is not a collaborative thing. It's something that is done in silos, as most of the services we create today in government. We don't have room for continuous improvement of those rules. And lastly, and the most important thing, it's really hard to have an accountability of the way we implement the rules today.
That's great. Thanks so much. P, did you have anything else, or do you want to, are we okay to move on? Sorry, I know you were interrupted. Yeah.
Yes, briefly. Well, I mean, we are all living this right now. So to all the parents out there,
Totally.
I see you.
Yes.
So just briefly, I think that the realization that digital government has too long been interpreted as a digital service or a digital process automation or the use of AI or the use of things to just complement the way we've always done things. But if we truly want to think about digital government, we need to think of government as digital. And if legislation is the rules upon which everything we do is based, then those rules right now are an analog paradigm. We only have access to them as a human readable thing. And then we end up using lawyers as modems to translate between, lawyers and policy and et cetera. But we're using people as modems to translate between an analog instruction and a digital instruction, and sometimes that instruction translation isn't consistent or isn't correct or is or becomes out of date. And with hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of rules, and the complexity of that exponentially rising, every change we make now in our legislative or regulatory or policy framework is getting harder and harder to predict change. So if we actually step back and think about legislation as the digital government as requiring digital rules, then legislation as code is one of the crucial enablers for better policy outcomes to be realized, for better predictability of change, for better modeling of change. And frankly, we as public servants, we care deeply about accountability, we care about traceability, we care about justice and equity. If we don't actually have direct line of sight and traceability of decisions made and the law, the authoritative rules upon which those decisions are made, captured at that point in time, then we are doing our societies a disservice. Legislation as code is a necessary precondition for AI, machine learning, and frankly, any form of computing use in public services, which is only going to exponentially grow, to meet that basic test of traceability, of accountability, and appealability. If a person can't appeal a decision, if we can't explain a decision, we have a fundamental problem. And that line of sight between implementation and law is hard now and increasingly impossible. And frankly, legislation as code provides a pathway and an opportunity to fix the current problem that we have.
That's just great. And I just want to say to the people that are attending this session, I'm brand new to Rules as Code. I was really excited to be invited to moderate this panel and learn a little bit more about it. And through my initial review, I came up with a quick definition, which I want to share with you from my perspective. And then there's this great video that was created by the school, did in partnership with the Community of Federation Regulators and the Department of Justice about Rules as Code, and we'll take a look at that in a second. But just as my sort of early understanding of where we're headed with this, it's where legislation and regulation are not only human readable, but are also drafted as machine readable. Machine readable legislation and regulation enable modeling and testing rules at the scale only possible through computing. And to take that further in the sort of testing lingo, and when I was reading this, I sort of understood that to mean broadly like smoke tests, regression tests, stress testing the rules. This is what the power of Rules as Code enables, which allows us to identify weaknesses and, of course, test real world impact of that. And so that's sort of my high-level view of what I learned quickly as I was beginning to ramp up for this session. And I think there's a great video now that we're going to queue up for people to watch. Great.
The world is changing. The rapidly increasing speed, scale, and power of technology is expanding how humans and machines interact. Our daily lives are increasingly shaped by digital technologies and services. We expect governments to evolve, adapt their processes, and deliver services in a digital world. Hi, I'm Scott, and I work at the Canada School of Public Service. We have been working with public servants across government on new ideas and approaches for the digital world. One of the areas we are interested in is how to create and implement rules for a digital age. Today, government writes rules for human use. These rules can be complex, making it difficult for individuals and businesses to understand their obligations. But if rules were also written for machines, those machines could interpret the rules for us. This could make our task of understanding our legal obligations a lot easier. But for machines to be able to use our rules, we would need to convert them to a language that machines can understand: code. This concept of converting rules into computer code is known as rules as code, and governments around the world are starting to explore the concept and consider its applications and possibilities. Rules as code has the potential to improve the quality and accessibility of rules, the consistency of their application, and the delivery of services to Canadians. Let me explain in more detail. Machines think logically, that is, in yes or no and in true or false statements. Turning rules into code could bring clarity and transparency to a rule by converting complicated legal jargon to distinct concepts and a logical sequence. This could make our rules less ambiguous and simpler to understand and interpret. Drafting rules in code form could allow us to use computer simulations to test how a rule would be applied in practice. This could help to close gaps between a rule's intent and how it is implemented, ultimately making a better rule. Today, rules are drafted for precision and meaning, not for readability or accessibility, so most of us will find them difficult to understand. If rules were published also for machines, we could build systems and services to make them easier to interpret and apply. Currently, many companies try to make rules easier to use, like this tax filing program. However, each tax year, the company must identify changes to the tax rules and hard-code these changes into their software. Not only is there a risk of misinterpretation of the rules, but software updates are costly. Instead, if the company's systems connected digitally with the official rule set, they would no longer need to hard-code the rules into the software and risk errors. Rules would be applied more consistently and costs could be reduced. Encoding rules creates new possibilities for faster, fairer, and more transparent services to Canadians. For example, rules could be implemented by machines as soon as they become available. This would allow us to build automated or semi-automated applications that support service delivery and that can deliver a result, explain how the rules were applied to get to the result, and all inputs and evidence considered. This could help Canadians understand how the rules apply to them. Once machines can process rules, there are so many possibilities for innovation. We worked with a number of partners to put rules as code into practice and test how we could apply the process to an existing rule. I'll tell you more about what we learned in the next video.
Hi, everyone. That's great. So I think we're going to dive in. There was an ask in the questions. I'm not sure if we're posting them through here. Someone was having a question about the main event versus our breakout room here. I don't know that I have the direct answer right now, but I know people are going to hunt that down and we'll get back to you. I mean, I certainly think we have some specific expertise on this particular conversation and bringing their perspective to the conversation, but hang tight and we'll get back to you on that. So as we begin this discussion, and by the way, though, that video and a second one will be available on the YouTube channel shortly, so you can look out for it there. So I thought maybe it might make sense as we dive in just to start with a really basic question. And that is, why is rules as code important? And Malco, I'll just pass that on to you to start with. Oh, you're muted.
It's okay now? Do you understand me?
Yeah.
All right. So why is rules as code important? I think that it's important because of three things, mostly. The first one is that today we have an important gap between what we want when we create public policies, so what we call the intent of our public policies, and what we finally get. So at some point, we have public policies, we create some rules or legislation, and at some point, especially if we're talking about public services, we have to implement it in software. And that could be a software developer that has to try to understand what the legislator, the lawmaker, or the politician wanted as a result, and that it's not always the case. So there's a lot of mismatch between what the original intent was and what the actual implementation is. So the first objective for me of rules as code is to close that gap between the what and what we get, what we want and what we get. But the second one, and which is the one I'm more involved with in my daily job, is this time gap between what we want and when do we get it. So there is a time between, even if there is no intent gap, there is a time between when we actually create our legislation and when we actually implement it, and so it becomes available for citizens in terms of, for example, automatic tax collection, or social benefit granting, or for companies for regulatory compliance. So it could take months or even years. And with rules as code, the idea is that we can reduce that gap to zero. That's the second one. And the third one, and I think Pierre already mentioned this, is that especially in a COVID and in a post-COVID crisis, we are going towards an automated society. So rules as code, it's not something that we are actually dreaming about. Governments are already automating different processes, and we have this choice of either have a framework that can make governments accountable for, in a way that is transparent and, as Pierre said, and appealable and accountable, or we can let them just go and create machine learning algorithms and automate stuff with artificial intelligence in a way that we cannot understand. And so we have this choice between rules as code that help us have a more transparent interpretation of what we're doing, or this Orwellian dystopia of mass surveillance and automated digital citizenship, control citizenship.
That's great. Jason, what are your thoughts? Why is rules as code important?
Well, I became interested in the topic because I was a kind of a self-taught computer programmer in a prior life before I went back to school to study law, and I was introduced to the topic of the access to justice gap while at law school, which is this idea, at least when you're talking about it in lawyer circles, this idea that most of the people who need help navigating the justice system can't get it. The very poor can get it by virtue of legal aid, and the very wealthy can get it by virtue of lawyers, but there's a huge gap in the middle of people who can't get that help. So my motivation, having been a computer programmer and looking at how badly the legal system was solving that problem, of the access to justice gap, I was interested in automating legal services. And the task of automating legal services is vastly easier if you can encode the knowledge that lawyers have about how laws work. That's where my motivation was, and that's why I started learning the technologies that are available for doing that. And then at the same time that I started learning the technologies, I heard about Pia's work in New Zealand, where they were trying to use those technologies from the government implementation side. And so now my conception of access to justice has expanded somewhat. That, you know, your ability to get access to things like supports from government, your ability to, you know, get a name change or a gender change done without having to go through an incredibly complicated process. That's a part of justice as well. That's a part of how we make fairness happen. So for me, it's an access to justice thing. It's one of the fundamental infrastructure pieces that we need in order to create a more just society.
That's excellent. And Pia, your thoughts on why is rules as code important?
So there's a few things there. I think the other two have covered a whole bunch of it, actually. So I'll boil it down to a couple of simple things. First of all, it's to address a problem that we currently have. We currently have a policy implementation divide, which used to be a gap. It's chasm, and it's now like starting to become planets apart, right? And that policy happens in its island and that implementation happens on its island. The ocean between means that we are not, as a system, working very well. Everyone's polishing their, cogs in the machine, but the car's on the side of the road and grass is growing up through it because it can't operate, because the pieces aren't connected. Actually getting multidisciplinary development of policy in the first place, understanding the intent, understanding the outcomes, doing some concept modeling, doing some experimentation of what that would look like in implementation from day one, not draft something and then try implementing it. From day one, having a multidisciplinary approach does a few things. It achieves better rules. So this isn't just about rules as code. Rules as code is sort of what people hear and they think it's about the implementation side and they go, oh, that's not me, that's implementation side. No, this is about policy transformation and about closing the policy implementation divide. So multidisciplinary development of policy, and in particular legislation and regulation, creates better rules because you now have a way of testing with the sort of people who will be implementing rules at the end of the day, whether what you're saying is what they hear. A quick example, a quick example of that is from New Zealand. We took a thing called the Holidays Act, which was about defining the regulations for holidays pay. And it had been implemented in every place, private sector and public sector differently, even by the agency who owned the regulation, and cost, millions of dollars in missed payments and all this kind of thing. And when we had the policy person in the room with a developer from one of the payroll companies, they're like, oh, well, here's how I read that. The policy person said, well, that's not what I meant. What I meant was this. Well, why'd you say that? Well, what do you understand? Everyone has a different language. And so a multidisciplinary approach to developing even the human language of rules gets something which is more able to be consistently applied. So you get better rules. The second one is policy agility. When you create this multidisciplinary approach, you can more rapidly model, make changes, and have high confidence in the implementation. So it gives you high confidence policy agility. Marco spoke about the speed to delivery and such. It dramatically improves not just speed to delivery, but speed to impact. Right now, you sort of have, someone has a shiny idea, someone develops policy, someone develops regulation or legislation, maybe, or operating policy. Someone gets those, functional requirements and implements. Someone hears about the implementation and then, further does it. Like, it's huge. When you can close the gap of speed, even if it takes a little longer in policy or a lot less time, when people assume that legislative drafting takes months or sometimes years, you can do this in weeks, right? So it dramatically closes the gap. But at the point where you actually are enacting legislation in Parliament, you can have a code version that's ready to turn on straight away, not in months' time after you've gone through the process of now interpreting and all the rest of it. So the actual time for impact and the impact of your policy intervention being realized is so much shorter. But this is the problem. Everyone's operating within their function, within their team, within their mandate. And as a system, we are not working very well at all. And so what this takes is people are stepping outside of their discipline and outside of their mandate just a little bit, not to figure out how we can dance together, not to chart out which part of the dance floor you can have and which part of the dance floor I can have. That's not really how a party works. We need to figure out how to listen to the same music and actually dance together. I hope that makes sense.
I mean, I think it does. It's excellent. As a product person, someone who's been delivering and developing services for various levels of government, that chasm, as you say, between policy making and then execution has always been a fraught piece for me. And so I just want to ask all three of you maybe to cite your favorite example of where you've seen these come closer together. What do you think contributed to the success of making policy and the digital execution and that proper evaluative process of the rules prior to implementation or during the implementation happen? Where have you seen that be successful? Whoever wants to jump in, go for it.
Okay, I'll jump in. So there's so many examples I want to give. I am going to choose two. I'm sorry, I'm going to break the rule of just choosing one because I want to choose two different sorts. I think there are really good. There's a lot of areas of legislation and regulation and policy that do not make sense to codify, where you have clear judgment required. But in the cases of prescriptive rules, there's two really clear case studies. One is around service delivery and one is around regulation. So for service delivery, there's a lot of legislation out there, and particularly for benefits delivery or for anything, or taxation, anything which has conditions and calculation is a perfect case study, because codifying, and frankly my favorite example is France, so I'll leave Marco to talk more about exactly what they've done, but we've effectively modeled some of what we're doing on some of what they've done. Codifying authoritatively and in a single place the rules of eligibility and calculation means you can then use that as a source for service delivery, for screening, for self-assessment, for streamlining application processes, without building in that business logic into each one of those different applications individually. So it goes to the heart of Gov as a platform and reusable tools. So for service delivery, Rules as Code gives us a means of managing and maintaining the rules of eligibility and calculation more centrally, more easily, to give a better and faster delivery of value and service to citizens. The second case study, though, is regulation. And my favorite case study is actually around anti-money laundering, counterterrorism funding. So I got into this space when I was working for the Financial Intelligence Agency because we were looking at the exponentially growing financial sector, and the fact that there are more and more players, particularly with all the micro lenders and micro businesses in that space coming on over the last decade or so. How do you regulate an exponentially growing environment when you've got declining resources and your process of regulating is figuring out who's the biggest risk and then going and checking them, a sort of thing, and more and more self-assessments and more modeling to figure out who to go and check up on? It doesn't scale, right? So we started looking at, well, but why is everyone implementing the rules differently? So we started looking at how much of our regulatory regime was prescriptive, and we found heaps of it was. So then we started saying, well, if we did make this available as an API, not just as, as our interpretation, like if we actually had the authoritative AML/CTF rules available as API, what impact would that have? We had just one bank tell us, just one, that if they could actually consume our rules as code, it would save them $16 million a year. That was one bank. The regulators, for years and years and years, for decades, a lot of our countries have been going down the path of more principle-based regulation is good. The problem with principles-based regulation as a basic premise that it's basically good is it requires more interpretation, which requires more cost and investment, which actually gives a benefit to the large companies at the cost of the small companies. So then the large companies say it's good because it blocks out their small companies, but then it leads to more cost for the big companies. It basically hasn't worked. So one of the key outcomes here is use principles-based when you actually want to have judgment-based. But if you want consistency of implementation, make it at least some of it prescriptive. So for AML-CTF, we did some experimentation. We did some work with the financial sector, and we found that for prescriptive rules, or even for exemptions as they emerge and exceptions as they emerged through, the precedent-based legal system that we have, we could start to codify things that would dramatically reduce the cost. And one final quick thing on that is when you have an API, when you actually have your legislation as code, your regulation as code being used by the regulated sector, you can then monitor how they're using the rules. Whereas right now, they take our writings, they interpret it, they implement it. We have no line of sight of how they do it unless we go into their business and have a look. If their business systems are actually talking to our rules and we can monitor how they're using it, we can look for patterns that are unusual. Or we can say, why is that big regulated entity not using the authoritative government rules? Have they found some interesting loophole or whatever? It actually provides a level of visibility and helps us shift the paradigm for regulation into the 21st century in a way that is impossible by just continuing to throw more human resources at the problem.
That's really interesting, almost sort of turning it into like an automatic audit function, which I think is fascinating. So, Malco, Pia was nodding to you and something that happened in France. So do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. Just to develop a little bit on Pia's example, what happened in France is that we started working on this payroll service. And as a byproduct of that, we finished writing legislation as code, separating the actual implementation of the service from the rules themselves, and we created an API. And is with that API that another team and this is why rules as code also is really interesting for collaboration and innovation. There was this team just next door that said, we need this, but not for payroll. We need just for social benefits. And so they started coding the social benefits part of it. And that's how they created this self-assessment simulator called MEZED. I can tweet the link later. And that's the work, I guess, Pia, you were working on. And so that's just about service delivery. Then we have regulation. But I would like to add a third part, which is kind of really interesting, which is the rulemaking itself. So I'm not going to tell you that we have been writing code before the actual rules, because that is half not true, but it's half true. And I'm gonna give you a concrete example. So I just need to explain. So this experience is with a service called Lex Impact. This is not a service for citizens. This is a service for the parliament. So what happens in France is that usually when you want to pass the new budget bill, it is government that proposes, and then it is to parliament to amend. That's how it works. I don't know how it does work in other countries. And so what happens is the government somehow has some means to produce some impact studies and proposes this budget bill. But the problem is that Parliament does not have any means in France to say whether or not this is the actual impact that they want. And specifically, when they want to propose amendments, they don't know if those amendments are fair, and they don't know how those fair in the terms of impact, redistributive impact, and how much that's going to cost in terms of if you're going to win or not in terms of tax collection. And that's really important. So what happened is that at some point we say, okay, let's say we can help Parliament get the bill in paper, write it into code, create a user interface that allows parliamentarians to change some aspects of this new bill, click a button, and in real time see what the impact is going to be on people, on families, and on the budget of the state. So that's something that we did. So this not produces the actual new amendment in French or in English. And why it doesn't is because it is not needed. What is needed is actually to know if it's fair and if it's responsible in a fiscal term. And so how we did this, basically, as Pierre said, with multidisciplinary teams. So this is a team that works for Parliament, and there's a data scientist, there's a backend software developer, there's front-end software developers, there's a service designer, and also there are field experts or policy officers. So they all work together with the parliamentarians, and they write the new bill and then create and then test that the results are coherent with the actual results, with the actual economic performance or the actual study that the government provided, that the user interface is actually something that helps parliamentarians to on the work. And lastly, what this produces is new, not only a way to know the impact of the new rules, but also it provides new ways for parliamentarians to think about new reforms that they wouldn't have thought about just by themselves. So that is the third example. Of course, that the next step is to actually go and code the rules before, but I hope that that's just a matter of time.
That's amazing. That's a really neat example. Thank you. So Jason, just on your side of things, how do you see it affecting policymaking and what that can look like?
I mean, I look at the work that Malco is doing in France and the work that Pia is doing in Canada here, and I'm hopeful that the kinds of benefits that Malco is describing in terms of the ability to get the computer to do the thinking about what the implications of a different rule would be, it's going to cause a kind of a revolution in a bunch of different areas, and one of them is in policy development, because policy implementation is going to be a thing that's modelable and a thing that's testable, and in some areas it's going to be testable against population data. So you're going to be able to get very realistic projections of what certain legislative text might do in terms of the policy outcomes that you're interested in. But there's other techniques that become available to you when you're using these kinds of technologies, apart from being able to put in an example scenario and sort of see what the outcome for that person would be. You also have the ability to just have the computer generate any number of random scenarios and run those through the system. And now you've got a database of inputs and outputs that you can search for certain kinds of unintended consequences or very strange circumstances that ought not be there. And that provides you with a degree of quality assurance on the way the policies are being implemented that was not possible before. And then you've also got more advanced methods past that, where even without putting any information into the actual system, you can just analyze the rules by themselves. And because they're expressed in a particular way, it allows you to do what's called formal verification. And you can prove mathematically that if these rules are followed the way they're written, certain kinds of outcomes are impossible. So for example, if we make this amendment to this tax act, no one's taxes will go up, is a thing that you might be able to mathematically prove without even having to do the specific examples. So I liken it to the advent of spreadsheets in the profession of accounting. We are just on the verge of now being able to give tools to legislative drafters and policy implementers and software developers that are going to allow them to have the computer do the thinking about the impacts of laws, and deal with more data more quickly, more accurately, and deal with more complex forms of modeling than was possible before. And I like to tell people, particularly lawyers tend to be very concerned that as soon as you automate something, it's going to steal their job. The lesson that that accountants learned in the starting in the late 70s and early 80s at the advent of electronic spreadsheets was when you get better, when you get faster, when you get more accurate, and when you're able to do more things, people want more of you, not less. So I think it promises a kind of a new age in all of these professions that are touching on rules to be stronger than we are now.
That's great and exciting. I think, just trying to balance this sort of optimism, where do we see there being problems with trying to do this? What can go wrong? Can maybe, and I'll start with you, Malco, if you can maybe just talk to where do you think the pitfalls are in trying to go through and implement rules as code and its downsides? You're muted, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
Yes,
you're good now.
I'm always having a problem finding the button. So as Jason was saying, we don't. If we automate rules, we won't let lawyers without a job, not either civil servants. So I think the first thing or the first pitfall would be to try to automatize everything, or rather than automatizing everything or automating everything, is this idea of disintermediation. So the first thing that we imagine is that we're going to code rules and then we don't need civil servants to actually interact, for example, with the citizens. And that is not true. What you see is that what you're actually automating and getting out of it is all these 80% of really easy responses to do I actually I am eligible to this social benefit? Could I apply this case to me? So all those mechanical things that could be easily answered with a machine are going to free up the time of civil servants to respond to the more or lawyers or other professionals working in different kind of roles, to have the time to actually provide more value. And that is the case as well for companies. Instead of spending a lot of the time just for regulatory compliance, they can spend more time creating value for the customers. And as well, of course, citizens could spend more time being citizens, which is basically their role. So the first pitfall would be just imagine this as a complete disintermediation. And for me, the second pitfall would be to do this in a way that is not transparent, that is not collaborative, and specifically try to change everything at the same time. So if we just try to say, let's do rules as code, and we create a big committee, and we start thinking of the best way of actually implementing it, we will be, and we'll have this conference in 30 years, and we will asking, you're gonna ask me the same question. So why is the pitfall actually implementing rules as code? And so, how do we avoid that? We just need to try to find small steps to start building this from the bottom up, and that is find actual real problems that we can solve today. And that's how we're gonna get up and running. Those are the two I can think of now.
Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, overthinking how to get there, it sounds like a real challenge for government on all the things. But so Pia, I don't know what your thoughts are on sort of where are the pitfalls and downsides to what we're trying to do here and where things can go wrong.
Okay, so the first thing that comes up with people is because government has got into the business of outsourcing our responsibility. So it's kind of like we publish our legislation, you're accountable for interpreting it. And certainly in some of the countries I've worked, and I don't know Canada well enough yet to know whether this is the pattern in Canada yet. So please take this with a grain of salt. But there seems to be a pattern of when you call government to say, have I applied it correctly? There's you'll need to go see your lawyer about that. There's certainly in some of the other countries I've worked. So it's kind of like we're putting out the instruction, but then not helping people make sure that they've met it correctly. So the first question that one of the big questions we had in Australia a couple of years back, and it was interesting because it was the Treasury people asking the question, was but what happens if the API is wrong? If we had legislation as code, like let's talk, end goal here. If you had legislation as code, what's happened if it's wrong? It's like, well, what happens if your legislation's wrong? What happens if your instructions are wrong? What happens if your website's wrong? And the simple answer is government has processes to identify when something's wrong and to fix it. That's what we do. That's what we do. And it was interesting to see the whole room hold its breath because all the service delivery organizations were like, oh, what's Treasury going to say? And Treasury were like, oh, yeah, we do have processes for that and it'll be fine. Okay, cool. So the main concern people seem to have is what if it's wrong? Well, there's mechanisms to deal with that. But it gets to the existential question of, in government, is it good enough in the 21st century for us to put out the instruction without helping people know if they've met it? And if we want people to meet our instructions, excuse me, which is all that legislation is and all that regulation is an instruction. If we want people to apply our instructions, why wouldn't we provide them a reference implementation of the instructions? We may not make it mandatory, but why wouldn't we provide them with a simple consumable version that they can reuse? Just to make it easier. Even if they don't use it, they can use it as a reference model. So that's one of the things. The second one is of course, so the biggest problem is what if we get it wrong? But I also want to put the counter, which is people are starting to look at and are heavily experimenting with AI, as they should be. Fabulous world of opportunities there. People are experimenting with machine learning, with neural networks and all kinds of fun stuff. The problem is if we don't have traceability to actual decisions being made, then we create a more inequitable society. So the real question is not so much what's the risk of doing this, because rules are already being encoded today and we already have a problem today and we need to solve that problem, which is, as we've outlined in several different ways on this call. So we need to solve the problem that we have. It's not like there's something new and how do we, and what's the risk of doing that? It's the risk of keeping what we have, and it's the risk of doing these new exciting things that we can do with machines and with quantum computing and with AI without having this basic fundamental trust infrastructure in place. So I would like to challenge everyone who is seeing this or tuning into this conversation to have a serious think about what does trust infrastructure look like. I ran a session a little while ago in a different country in Australia, and we had around the table lots and lots of people from different departments, and we were talking about data sharing. And I said to them, okay, just pretend you're not a public servant for a second. Just be you for a second. Would you feel comfortable to share your personal data with government? Everyone's like, oh, no. And we're like, okay, what would it take for that to be the case? And so they all sort of said, well, I'd want to have transparency of how it's being shared. I'd want to know that there's oversight. I'd want to know this. I'd want to know this. The very next question was like, okay, and what are your department doing? And they switched back into their professional mode, and none of those things they said that they wanted as citizens were covered by any of their work programs. So think as a citizen for a minute. Think about your own family's information and data and decision making. Think about people you know who use social services, who use government services, and think about people who need to have that appealability. What do you need to trust government? Well, I would argue you need to have traceability back to the law. When a decision is made, you need to have traceability back to the law and to policy and to authorities. You need to have a ledger of some sort. You need to have, capture those decisions, and me as a citizen should be able to see every decision that's been made about me. I should be able to see a record of those decisions. So you need to have some sort of record, and everyone does their record keeping in their administrative data in different business systems, but where are all the decisions regarding me in government? And, let's assume that we're not talking about the spooks for a moment, because, of course, they're their own special little world. But, everything that's not intelligence focused, why can't I see every decision about me? I need to be able to find that. I need to be able to audit it. I need to be able to see it. I don't want to just have government say, you can trust me because I'm the government. I need to know what the accountability measures are. I guess where I'm getting at is rather than thinking about this or that, this technology or this opportunity or that thing, we need to think as a system. What does a trustworthy government look like? How can we be trustworthy rather than asking for trust? That basic question, I think, is a key one we need to ask. And for me, legislation as code, rules as code, and better rules, frankly, is part of that journey, but it's not the whole of it. And if people start thinking about the whole of it, we have a better chance of all the parts converging around the values and the outcomes we're trying to get to.
So, Jason, I don't know what your thoughts are here.
It's a complicated question, because when you ask, like, what are the pitfalls of rules as code, we've got a bunch of different parts that are all rules as code. Pia and Malco have talked about some of the things that are kind of perceived pitfalls with the implementation side of rules as code, and how do we deal with the perceptions that there are risks surrounding privacy and trust on that end. And Malco was also mentioning the problem of finding small steps. I'd like to elaborate on that a little bit, because one of the challenges that we are going to face is this works best if the encoding happens at the same time the drafting is done, right? That is the kind of idealized sense of how rules as code should work at some point in the future. Trying to find evolutionary steps toward that is very challenging, because when you talk to legislative drafters about what their life is actually like, it is surprising how little of their time is spent drafting brand new laws. The majority of their time is spent making small amendments to existing legislation, which is not an opportunity to start encoding something from scratch. So the from scratch method will only work a small percentage of the time. If the technology is only useful to legislative drafters a small percentage of their workday, they don't have the incentive to invest in the learning that would be necessary in order to acquire the skills to use it. So there's a lot of kind of logistical problems in terms of integrating, first finding the right way of doing this, finding the right technologies that make it as easy as possible. Then make those technologies as accessible as possible to people. And then find some way to make them valuable to people who are in the system in small incremental ways. Because once it's valuable to use for a small amount of time, it's worth learning. And once you've learned it, now you have a hammer and everything looks like a nail. And then we can expect people to kind of, it will grow on its own at that point. In the same way that electronic spreadsheets, no one had to go out and market that idea. You just had to show it to people and let them try it. And they were like, oh yeah, this is definitely going to help, right? I think it will get to that point, but evolving us to that point is difficult. And right now, the steps that a person would have to go through are more like learning to become an expert programmer like Malco, which is an unrealistic expectation for the vast majority of people. So that for me is the problem that I'm focused on solving, is how do we get an easy on-ramp to this?
That's really great. And Malco, did you want to add something?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to react. I think that there is a big pitfall of actually not doing rules as code, and that is explicability. As Pia said, we're going with all these algorithms and we're automating stuff in ways that we don't understand, and we basically are giving away our power to understand what we are doing with our lives to machines. And so it's like in Faust, when Faust asks Mephistopheles, we say that in English, Mephistopheles, he has a wish and needs help with this love affair. I mean, at some point he cannot control the consequences. So I think that as a society we all face this problem of the magician that cannot control his spells. And so if we don't have, even more important than trust is this explicability platform of know what we're doing on the basis of the more prescriptive and basic way of rules, we will end up with algorithms that are going to do stuff that we don't understand and we cannot control.
Yeah, that is, it's interesting. I have experienced this in the delivery sense of trying to execute these rules. Iteration kind of terrifies people a little bit. They kind of do all the work, they get it right, and they're like, okay, here it is, and do exactly as this because we put all this thought into it. So I just wanted to ask a question about does this mean that there'll be more frequent iteration on these rules? Is that kind of a goal? And do we see any challenges with that? I sometimes think that slow can be better because it provides a little more like absorbing of what's going on, particularly as we see the world changing around us really quickly and not jumping to regulation too quickly. So just thinking about faster iteration on rules and what that might mean. Pia, yeah?
So I might go first if that's all right with this one. So here's the thing, slower isn't better necessarily. There is an iteration and slow is not mutually exclusive. So what is the ideal? Well, first of all, policy change is not going to get slower because the change required around us is not getting slower. COVID is just the start. We're going to see a rolling, emergencies more and more and more. So we're in kind of the age of emergencies, and they're only going to get more globalized and more profound. Number one. Number two, user needs are changing faster than ever because of the pace of change is only increasing, not decreasing. And third of all, we in government are universally pretty terrible at keeping our finger on the pulse and then responding to something, because people figure out their budgets, years in advance, and then they get their program, and then they implement their program, and then they measure against the program that they had. So it's like, if anywhere on that spectrum of time, right, on that timeline, the actual need changed fundamentally, no one is motivated systemically, like individually they are, but systemically no one's motivated to say, actually, we need to pivot in fundamentally because this is no longer a need, or because the need has shifted, or because of whatever. We are not good at operating as a system. We are only good at operating as tiny little business units. So we need to be able to respond to change faster, which means continuous policy reform, not big bang policy changes, number one. Number two, back to your point about slow and steady. I've seen heaps of areas of legislation where they've taken a year or 2 years to think through every scenario, and then the implementation people have seen it, or users of the policy have seen it, and within a second have been like, here's a use case that breaks that. The point isn't that slow and steady isn't good. It is good. It just needs more people in the room. You need to have representatives of your users. You need to have user-centered policy that understands, how is this policy going to be used? Let's get at least a couple of representatives of people that are likely to use this policy, whether they're a payroll company, or whether they're a implementation team, or a standards team, or a compliance team, or the regulated entities, who of course, and of course regulated entities say we don't want any regulation, but they actually do. They want, but you balance that, right? And so having multidisciplinary design of policy in the first place, you can still take your year if you want, but you're getting better rules. So this isn't, forget the rules as code part of this, just for a moment. We need better rules that are drafted with different people in the room so that there is a better chance they are implemented well. And to your point about, so in terms of iterative change and constant change, ideally, we need to get to a position where policy development, for the vast majority of policy change, is iteration on the current status. We need that sort of policy to be developed fast, because people are starving, are without jobs, are, in ESDC, we were trying to roll out a new benefit at the beginning of COVID. And the fact is that the number of people joining the unemployment queue were, 50,000, then 100,000, then 200,000 a day. So the usual, let's take our time with this. We need to respond to the urgency of the people we serve. If we can't do that, what is the point of us at all? Okay, totally. I'll leave it there.
That's great. Jason, what are your thoughts on sort of more rapid rule changing?
So there's a yes and a no here, and the yes is if you're using the right kinds of technologies for encoding your legislation and your rules, you can encode them in a way that is kind of independent of what you're going to use them for. So you can kind of modularize that out. You can say, here's my encoding of this act or this regulation. And you can rely on that to deal with the legal logic aspect of whatever application you need to build. So the reason that rules as code helps with iteration is when you build an application that has kind of outsourced the legal logic to rules as code, all you need to do is update the encoded law and your apps are automatically giving correct answers. So when the rules are iterated, it's easier to get from a change in the rule to a change in your implementation. So that's kind of a benefit if there are iterations happening and you remove an impediment to iterating on the rules because it's easier to kind of do all the downstream things. That's the yes side. The no side is what happens right now is the legislature enacts a piece of legislation and then it gets implemented. And in the course of the implementation process, all the people who are trying to write the software to implement it are, as Pia points out, immediately recognizing the mistakes in the drafting. Immediately. And this is a thing that I spend my day doing, and I promise you, give me 5 minutes with a law, and I will find the problems that make it very, very difficult to implement. So we can't, for political reasons, we can't have the legislature reopening legislation every time an implementer somewhere finds a bug. Right? There are motivations against opening debates into existing legislation. That's not the way the process works, which is part of the reason that the happy path here is to have programmers in the room while the legislation is being drafted, because that allows what would otherwise be an iterative process back and forth between implementers and legislative drafters. It allows it to happen in one room in advance before the legislation is enacted. So because we can't iterate on legislation is part of the reason that we need the coders in the room for the drafting.
Malco, do you have any thoughts on this one as you've been on your journey in France?
Wow, it's the last. it's quite difficult to find this happy to middle path, but I agree that it is just a rapid iteration on rule making is just a solution for what we actually want to achieve. As Pia said, is a way to keep up with rule making and service delivery, to keep up with the needs and changing reality that is faster than ever. So I do agree that there is this two-step solution. The first one is to be able to iterate as fast as possible when we are creating the rules, because I agree with Jason as well that after it's really, really hard to change. So this iteration also could be in smaller steps. It's not the same thing to have just one scenario that I have the whole data you need to actually test the full impact of your rule. So the better the team you can have with everybody on the room to iterate on the impact of the new legislation, the better. But that's one side of the equation. And then when you create the rule, and that is the important thing for me, is that as you already had your developers working with the team creating the rules, they already can write technological ways, or as we call as developers, APIs, or technological blocks that we can deploy at the same time as the legislation, so we can deliver the outcomes of that legislation as fast as possible. So if we have those two solutions at the same time, the multidisciplinary team and the technological blocks that allow then to deliver fast all the outcomes that we want from our legislation, I think that we can achieve this objective of rapid or fast value or impact delivery.
That's great. So just going to ask one more question, and then we'll head into the Q&A part. Thinking about the audience of this breakout, I'm sure they span, policymakers, program leaders, possibly lawyers, people who are writing the legislation. How can you maybe speak to the different roles and how they interface with the process of making rules as code and what it means to them in trying to do their jobs like day to day? If they wanted to start tomorrow, how would they begin? And go for it, Pia.
Okay. Well, first of all, we should probably just quickly say what the outcome of the process is, because there have been some questions about whether the outcome is pseudocode, which people would find difficult to interpret it, because that will get clarity on the roles that people play then, if you like. If you are a drafter or a person involved in policy and you want to adopt some of this thinking, the very first step is very easy. The very first step is identify who will use your policy or legislation or regulation, who is a user of it, particularly, or a couple of users, particularly if you can, who are, if you like, as neutral as possible. So we've got some areas, there's work happening at the moment around potentially using some better rules methods to explore, some of the trucking regulations. There are different organisations who are very motivated and even polarised in their perspective of each other, but who would actually implement the rules would be the payroll company, who don't care, who are pretty ambivalent to what the rules are. They just need to know that they can interpret them right. So they would be a good partner to have in the room. So identify your users, number one, and invite them in the room. Number two, concept modelling. Just actually getting up on a page and drawing out the logic flow of what it is you're trying to achieve and how it would flow. That it's a 1 day or a half day exercise to do concept modeling with those different people in the room, because then it helps you understand collectively what it is you're trying to achieve. And if you have a multidisciplinary team in the room for that concept modeling, it helps you achieve a language which communicates universally what what you're trying to do. Which gives you a better chance of then getting the human readable version to be consistently applied by anyone. So you could start that straight away. And you could start doing some concept modeling, and you could have that multidisciplinary team, and you could just say, you know what, we have to do drafting anyway, we have to do our policy instructions anyway. Let's just do a little experiment, a 2 or 3 week experiment of doing it this way, of taking that approach, rather than someone does the policy, the drafting instructions, someone does the drafting, someone, takes, all of the pre-stuff prior to it assumed to be to actually be enacted in Parliament before you even talk to anyone in implementation side. Use the pre, what do they call it? Sorry, it's very early and I'm shifting context a lot. You can do consultations. You can do pre-release of legislation, of drafting for consultations. Use those mechanisms you already have access to today in Canada to explore some of these possibilities. And probably most of all, partner with CSPS. The Canadian School of Public Service are just doing great work in this space, and there's a few of us who are all sort of engaging with them to do some exploration. There's a whole bunch of guides on this that we can certainly provide some links to you. But just knowing your users, getting in a room and doing 1 or 2 or 3 week dedicated, just trying a different way. And then, the notion of introducing an agile test, iterate, then scale approach to your policy work, whether it's legislation or regulation, or whether it's just straight up policy, introducing user-centered design, agile iterative processes, and test-driven approach with your users in the room, I guarantee you will see better outcomes, better policy, better rules, better everything. And I just want to pick up on something Jason said before. I don't think it's that there are mistakes in legislation. It's more about ambiguities, cross-disciplinary ambiguities. When you say this, you mean this. And I'll give you a very specific example, actually from the Holidays Act. They said for every working week, you get this much holiday pay. It's like, what's a working week? What's a working week for me versus you? What's a working week for a gig economy person? What's a working week for a person running multiple side hustles or a self-employed person? Like, what are you talking about? And another example from New South Wales government, they said a particular benefit was available for parents with a child when the child was 4.5 years old. And it said 4.5 years old. And we're like, okay, is that 365 divided by 2? Is that 6 months? Is that 26 weeks? And even though the difference of that ambiguity may be fairly small, that's still tens of thousands of families affected by that potential ambiguity. So you could start today with those very simple things. Get your users in the room, test-driven and agile approach, and just dedicate like a week or two. Don't spend months and months and months trying to put out a project plan. Certainly don't go and try and get funding to do a new innovation project, because then you'll be stuck in that rut for years. Just try it. Just get in a room with some people and just give yourself a week to go and try something different, and you'll see if it works for you or not.
So we're just about to start our Q&A, I think. So why don't we dive into that? It's now 2:35. And I'll just throw it to Jason first. There were a couple of questions. Lisa had a question. Rules as code sounds like a specific kind of expert system. Is that correct, or is it somehow different than that?
That's a great question. So for context, for people who may not be familiar, expert systems are kind of the thing that we referred to as artificial intelligence in the 1980s. And they are a type of system where the rules are encoded in that system. And then you ask it a question, what the thing that you'd like to find out, and it knows enough about what factors are relevant for answering that question in order to ask you back for the pieces of information it needs in order to calculate its way through the process. So that's what an expert system is. They've gone something out of style, I would say, and there's things that are called expert systems now that are really they're not expert systems in the sense that they're not using the rules in order to figure out what questions to ask. That's kind of the technical definition of what an expert system is. So is rules as code expert systems? No, but rules as code could be implemented using programming languages that could then be interpreted by expert systems. So the rules as code is just the encoding of the knowledge contained in the legislation. What you choose to do with that is kind of up to you. And one of the things that you can do with it, and I frankly think a very impressive thing that you can do with it, is to put it into expert systems. There's actually an organization in Australia called Austly that has a tool called DataLex, and that is an expert system that operates off of encodings of legislation. And if you have the opportunity to take a look, there's some available examples, and it's impressive how easy it is to move from the encoding of the legislation to an application that's able to figure out on its own what questions to ask, give you an answer, explain its answer, and then give you links back to the original source material. So expert systems are one of the things that we could do with rules as code, but it's not rules as code itself.
Great. And Brad had a question here. It was sort of responding to something you had said, Jason, but maybe Malco can take this. It was around, if you have coders in the room, do you end up with two versions of your rules? One's written by policy staff and lawyers, and one's written by programmers. And maybe you could talk a little bit about some of that there, Malco.
Yeah. Okay.
So having two versions of the policy code and the programmed code.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the how the actual process would go.
Or is there a risk that you'll end up with two? I think the question is, having coders in the room is an interesting way to think about writing the rules as code, but would that leave us with two versions? Has that seen that occur? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Go ahead. Yeah, it was. If you already had something in mind, I can jump in.
I'll throw just one quick thing is, we already have two versions. It's called English and French. So all the questions about, how would you make sure it's the same? How do we do it now? And how do we do it now is through robust testing and checking and comparison. That's what we do now. So adding rules as code is just a third language. So Canada is better prepared than a lot of countries for this because it already has the processes and patterns and methods of ensuring isomorphic drafting of regulation legislation in two languages.
And would you say, Pia or Marco, would you even say it's further than that? Because you've got the rule written down in two languages, then you have the execution, which often isn't exactly the same as the rule. So are we already in a situation where there's a lot of implementations of the code based on what is written down in the rule of law versus what is the system actually configured to do? That's sort of a today reality. Yeah, go ahead, Marco.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say that even when we are writing in English and in French or in other language, that happens, for example, with tax rules. Even lawyers do some calculations with Excel spreadsheets. And so there are already a lot of implementations beyond what we are actually writing in paper. And so just one small step to make these converge would be to transform those Excel spreadsheets in, for example, just this rule writing in code with just one scenario. A second small step to converge would be to have some 10 scenarios, and of course a better way to converge would be to have service designers and lawyers and coders and having a data scientist with the whole data set of taxpayers to actually verify that the rule has the exact impact that we want. And so the only thing that we can do adding more people is to making converge already diverging versions of the rules.
There is one thing to add, though, and I will again use an example from New Zealand. One of the things that you can do with code that you can't do with the human version is tests. So one of the things that we used in New Zealand was we said to the policy people, particularly for some of the benefits in coding we were doing, looking at looking at eligibility and calculation. So first of all, to your point, Dara, we found areas where the benefit was not being paid correctly because how it had been encoded in the business system was not the same as the legislation, because someone 30 years ago had rounded a number down in an Excel spreadsheet calculation, and that had been hard coded. So it's addressing that problem. But we said to the policy people, okay, let's write some test cases. A person with these attributes, do they get it and how much do they get? A person with these attributes, do they get it and how much do they get? And you can actually generate and frankly work with the policy people to create those test cases for your area. And of course, again, this is more relevant to areas that have some prescriptive rules. So please see this as more relevant to areas of regulation, service delivery, and trade is a good one. There's a few specific areas where this is more helpful. So write your test cases. Add your test cases to your rules as code suite, and this is where OpenFisca has been amazingly helpful, because you can throw the demographics of the entire nation at the rules and say, if I make this change, what's the impact on population? Who are we not serving unintentionally? What's the impact on budget? What's the impact on programs? You can actually do that kind of modeling, right? Because that then helps the policy people see, it is or isn't hitting the mark. What do you mean it doesn't meet that test case? Why is that? Because we accidentally conflicted with another benefit that already exists by having this one. Oh, okay. So test cases is how you get confidence that it is meeting the policy intent. And again, you can do this in 2 or 3 weeks. The teams can be saying, well, here's the human readable version, here's the machine readable. They're literally sitting side by side, writing and showing how it works and testing back with each other consistently.
Okay.
And just to add to that, even if you had two different versions of the same rule, if the test gives the same results, you don't care.
That's such a good
impact
point.
in the end that matters.
Yeah. So Jason, here's one for you around compliance. How can rules as code increase compliance of your rules, regs, and legs?
I mean, the simple answer is by making it possible to make it automatic. If you have good encodings being made of your regulations at the time that they're drafted, and those encodings are being published and available to people via a kind of an API that anyone can take their own application and have it interact with, then all you need to do in order to build a piece of compliant software is point it at the server that knows what the rules are and what the answers to the questions are, and have it do the math itself. So I'm not sure. It's interesting to ask, would compliance improve? Would we get substantive compliance improved as a result of rules as code? I don't know. It would be interesting to see. What we do know is that the level of compliance that we have would become less expensive. It would become drastically less complicated to comply as much as we are complying now. And that might be a starting place in order to spend more resources on edge cases and get more compliance ultimately.
That's great. And just following on that question, and Pia or Marco, feel free to answer. In terms of increasing transparency and accessibility into the rulemaking process, how can rules as code make the rulemaking process more democratic? Can you talk a little bit about that co-design or aspects you were describing?
If I can just give one quick example, we tried to undertake before COVID crisis a retirement reform in France. This is really funny because 3 years ago I proposed that we started doing some scenarios with OpenFisca. So I couldn't convince at the time. And so what happened was that a lot of people were not happy about what we thought about the impacts that were going to be. And so a lot of people started striking on the street, not striking, but mobilizing and demanding the government to give really personalized detail for each situation of the impact of this new reform. And the problem is the government was not able to give them one because they didn't think about. And so they say, okay, in this emergency, we need to find a way to give an answer to the people. And so they tried to work for months to create these simulators, but it was too late, because this elaboration part or drafting part of this new policy was not thought as something that you would communicate. And so the reform failed, basically. If, in a way, we would have worked from the outset in a transparent way, writing the rules in open source and using the same version to explain people what are we doing, for economists and statisticians to actually test the real impact of the rules, and for developers and civil servants or entrepreneurs to deploy the simulators to allow people to assess the impact of this reform, maybe we would have a very, very different outcome.
That's great. I think we're about a minute to go, so I just have one quick one I'll throw at the panel, and this is around strategies or tactics for facilitating that collaboration with a team. I think we touched on it a little bit earlier, and I think, Pia, you were talking a little bit about sort of sketching things out, but I don't know if anyone has any particular hints or tricks, thoughts on how to begin. Yeah.
I think we shared some of those, but how about we share a bunch of links? And I'll quickly just say, rather than just embracing the concept of rules as code, embracing the concept of policy transformation, of iterative, agile, user-centered policy development, I think is the huge mindset shift. Otherwise, you're gonna get part of the benefit, but not the whole of the benefit. And that would be my biggest tip, to see this as an opportunity to close the divide as opposed to a shiny new thing.
I would say the part that has been encouraging and surprising to me is to see the way that the people who are professional drafters are responding to the experience of having programmers in the room for the drafting process, who are trying to go through that interdisciplinary process and concept mapping or whatever other communication technique you use in order to try and bridge that gap. It has been almost universal that the legislative drafters come out of that process saying, this process makes us better at our job, even if we did nothing with the code after we leave this room. The process of trying to write it while we were in the drafting room made the law better. And so there's an opportunity there to get short-term benefits without needing to have solved the entire process from legislative drafting all the way down to implementation, just by being interdisciplinary in the way that we think about new policies, new regulations, new legislation.
That's great.
And
go ahead, yeah.
And just one last comment: try to find a really small problem that you face in your day-to-day job. Use the open source tools available on the internet, and join the conversation. I am going to be there. Jason's going to be there. PA is going to be there, and many other practitioners. So please don't hesitate to just join this movement.
Thanks so much.
Here.
And just thank you, Malco, Pia, and Jason, for this great conversation today. It was really great. I wanted just to encourage all the participants, they can go back to the VExpo so they can finish the day with the keynote, Andrew Ng. I hope you've enjoyed today's panel discussion, and you can look forward to some links coming your way to help with this, and of course, reach out to the presenters. Thanks.